The crash was violent. Metal screamed. Glass exploded. The world spun, then went dark. When the Mafia boss opened his eyes again, he didn't move. He heard voices, doctors, nurses, the steady beep of machines, and then her voice, his wife. She leaned close to his bed, fingers brushing his hand. Her voice was soft, careful. "They think you won't wake up," she whispered. He kept his eyes closed, kept his breathing shallow. Then her tone changed. Relief crept in, and something colder. "Do you know how long I've waited for this?" she said quietly. "No guards, no men, no shadow following me everywhere." She laughed, a sound he had never heard from her before. "I already spoke to your lawyer," she continued. "If you don't wake up, everything becomes mine." The machines kept beeping. The room stayed calm, but inside the man lying motionless on the bed, something shattered. Because the accident hadn't taken his life, it had exposed the truth he never saw coming. "Stay with me until the end," because what he decides to do after hearing those words will change his marriage and his empire forever. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. Marco Santelli had built his empire from nothing. 23 years ago, he was just another kid from the wrong side of Brooklyn, watching his mother count pennies for groceries. Now he controlled half the city's underground operations. Construction, shipping, waste management. Everything flowed through his hands. But lying in that hospital bed, none of that mattered. What mattered was the woman he'd shared his life with for 15 years. The woman he'd trusted with everything was already planning his funeral. The accident had happened 3 days ago. Marco remembered every detail leading up to the crash. He'd been driving back from a meeting with his lieutenants. The streets were wet from an earlier rainstorm. He'd taken the usual route home through the industrial district. No bodyguards that night. He'd wanted to clear his head, think about some decisions that needed making. The truck came out of nowhere, ran a red light, slammed into the driver's side of his Mercedes at 40 miles per hour. The impact sent his car spinning across the intersection. Everything went black. When consciousness first flickered back, Marco could hear fragments. Paramedics shouting, sirens wailing, someone saying his pulse was weak, then nothing again for hours. The next time awareness returned, he was here. Private room, expensive equipment, the kind of medical care that money could buy. But his body felt disconnected, heavy, like it belonged to someone else. When he tried to move his fingers, nothing happened. When he attempted to open his eyes, the muscles wouldn't respond. Panic should have set in. Any normal person would have been terrified, but Marco had survived too much to break that easily. Instead, he listened. He learned the rhythms of the place. Shift changes, visiting hours, the difference between footsteps in the hallway. And he waited. The first visitor had been his lawyer, Anthony Ricci. Tony had stood beside the bed, briefcase in hand, speaking in that careful way lawyers do when they think no one can hear them. He'd talked about medical proxies, about business continuity, about what would happen if Marco never woke up. Marco filed every word away. His underboss, Vincent Corelli, came next. Vinny had always been loyal, but Marco could hear the calculation in his voice as he discussed territory disputes and revenue streams. The sharks were already circling, even while the body was still warm, but it was Elena who revealed the most. His beautiful wife, the woman who used to trace patterns on his chest while he fell asleep. The woman who laughed at his terrible jokes and made him feel human when the weight of his world became too heavy. She visited every day, always at the same time. Always when the hallway was quiet and the nursing staff was busy with other patients. And every day, she revealed a little more of who she really was. "The doctors say your brain scans show minimal activity," she had whispered on the second day. "They're using words like vegetative state and long-term care. They want me to make decisions about your treatment." Marco had felt her fingers brush his forehead. The touch that used to comfort him now felt calculating, clinical. I told them I needed time to process, Elena continued. But honestly, I've been processing this for years. Living with you, Marco, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if today would be the day someone put a bullet in your head, or mine. She'd paused then. Marco could hear her breathing, could smell her perfume, the same scent she'd worn on their wedding day. You never understood what it was like, she said, being married to a ghost. Because that's what you were, wasn't it? Always disappearing, always handling business, always choosing the family over our family. The family, that's what they called it in their world. The organization, the brotherhood, the thing that had given Marco everything he had, including the money that paid for Elena's designer clothes and jewelry, the house in the Hamptons, the life of luxury she'd grown accustomed to. I used to love you, Elena had whispered. God help me, I really did. But love doesn't survive neglect, Marco. Love doesn't survive always coming second to your empire. That's when Marco had understood. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about power. This was about 15 years of resentment that had been building behind her smile. 15 years of feeling invisible, while he built something that would outlast them both. The lawyers explained everything, Elena had continued. If you're declared incompetent, I become your legal guardian. I control the medical decisions. I control the finances. And if something happens to you while you're in this state. She'd trailed off, but the implication was clear. Marco had built his reputation on reading people, on seeing through lies and half-truths, on understanding motivations and weaknesses, but he'd been blind to the woman sleeping beside him every night. He'd been deaf to the growing silence between them. He'd been too focused on external threats to notice the enemy inside his own home. Now, as Elena's footsteps echoed down the hallway after her latest visit, Marco faced a choice. He could reveal himself, open his eyes, speak, show everyone that he was awake and aware. But doing that would tip his hand too early. Elena would adjust her story, play the relieved wife, and he'd never know the full extent of her plans. Or he could wait, stay silent, let her believe she was in control while he gathered intelligence about who else might be involved. Because Elena wasn't smart enough to orchestrate something like this alone. Someone was helping her. Someone with knowledge of his business operations and legal vulnerabilities. The machines continued their steady rhythm. The hospital carried on around him. And Marco Santelli, the man who had built an empire on patience and careful planning, settled in for the longest con of his life. Because when you're hunting wolves, sometimes you have to lie very, very still. Very still. The third day brought visitors Marco hadn't expected. He recognized the voices immediately, two of his most trusted men, discussing business as if he were already dead. The shipment from Miami needs to be rerouted, said Tommy Marconi, his voice carrying that familiar Brooklyn accent. Elena's been asking questions about the warehouse schedules. Since when does the boss lady care about operations? Replied Sal Benedetto. Since she started meeting with people she shouldn't be meeting with. Marco's pulse quickened. But the machines registered nothing unusual. Elena wasn't working alone. The pieces were starting to fit together, and the picture wasn't pretty. You think she knows? Sal asked. She knows enough. Question is, what are we going to do about it? Their footsteps moved closer to the bed. Marco could feel their presence. These men who had sworn loyalty to him, now discussing his wife like she was a problem to be solved. Marco always said family comes first, Tommy said quietly, but he never specified which family. The conversation ended abruptly when a nurse entered. The men left without another word, but their message was clear. Lines were being drawn, alliances were shifting, and Elena was at the center of it all. That evening, she returned for her usual visit, but this time she wasn't alone. The doctors want to discuss options, said a voice Marco didn't recognize. Male, older, authority in his tone. What kind of options? Elena asked. Well, given the extent of his injuries and the lack of neurological response, we need to consider long-term care, facilities. The costs here are significant, and insurance will only cover so much. Marco felt Elena's hand rest on his arm. Her touch was gentle, but her words cut deep. Money isn't the issue, she said, but quality of life is. Marco wouldn't want to live like this. He was always so strong, so independent. Lying here like this, completely helpless. It's not living. I understand your concern, Mrs. Santelli. These decisions are never easy. How long do people typically survive in this condition? The question hung in the air like smoke. Marco wanted to open his eyes, to speak, to show them both that he was very much alive, but something told him to wait, to listen. It varies, the doctor replied. Some patients can remain stable for years. Others, well, complications can arise. Infections, organ failure. The body has ways of letting go when the mind isn't there to fight, and if complications do arise, we would make every effort to provide comfort care. But, ultimately, it would be your decision as his medical proxy whether to pursue aggressive treatment or allow natural progression. Elena squeezed his arm. To anyone watching, it would look like a loving gesture, but Marco felt the calculation in her grip. I want what's best for him, she said, even if it's hard for me. The doctor left shortly after, but Elena remained. She moved closer to the bed, her voice dropping to that intimate whisper he had once found comforting. Do you remember our honeymoon in Tuscany? She asked. You said we'd go back someday when things calmed down, when you could step away from business and just be Marco, not the boss. She laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. 20 years I waited for that trip. 20 years of next month, and after this deal, and when things settle down. But things never settle down in your world, do they? Marco remembered that conversation. He remembered making those promises. He also remembered the phone calls that had interrupted their honeymoon, the meetings he'd had to take, the way Elena's smile had faded a little more each day. I used to think you loved the business more than me, she continued, but I was wrong. The business was just another way to avoid intimacy, another wall between you and everyone who tried to get close. Her words stung because they carried truth. Marco had built walls. He'd had to. In his world, vulnerability was weakness, and weakness got you killed. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten that Elena wasn't the enemy. I found the papers in your safe, she said suddenly. The ones about the offshore accounts. The backup plans if everything fell apart. Did you really think I was that naive? Marco's mind raced. Those documents were supposed to be secure. Only 3 people knew the combination to that safe. Himself, his lawyer, and his accountant. Someone had talked. Vincent helped me understand what they meant, Elena continued. All those years you were protecting your assets, preparing for the day someone might come after you. But you never included me in those plans. I was just another liability to be managed. Vincent, his underboss, the man who had stood beside him through wars with rival families, who had sworn blood loyalty, who had been like a brother to him. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. He explained how things work in your world, Elena said. How widows don't inherit empires, how they become targets or burdens, how the smart ones disappear with whatever they can carry. She stood up, her heels clicking against the floor as she paced. But Vincent also explained something else, how accidents happen, how a man in a coma can't make decisions about his own care, how a loving wife might have to make impossible choices. The room fell silent except for the machines and Elena's breathing. Marco had heard enough. He understood the scope of the conspiracy now. Elena and Vincent working together. Maybe others. All of them circling like vultures, waiting for him to die or planning to help him along. Tomorrow, I'm going to tell the doctors I've made my decision, Elena said. That I want to transition you to comfort care. No more aggressive treatment. No more machines keeping you alive when your mind is already gone. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. The gesture that had once meant love now felt like a death sentence. Sleep well, Marco, she whispered. Dream about Tuscany. Her footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving Marco alone with the weight of what he'd learned. His wife wanted him dead. His second-in-command was helping her, and tomorrow they would begin the process of making it happen. But they had made one crucial mistake. They assumed he was helpless. They believed he was trapped in his broken body, unable to fight back. Marco Santelli had built his empire by being underestimated, by letting enemies think they had the upper hand before he struck. And as he lay there in the darkness, listening to the machines that were keeping him alive, he began to plan his resurrection. Because sometimes, the only way to catch a snake is to let it think you're already dead. Dead. The fourth day arrived with rain against the windows. Marco listened to each drop, counting seconds, measuring time the way a condemned man counts his final hours. But he wasn't condemned. Not yet. And that was the difference between survival and surrender. Elena's plan was elegant in its simplicity. A grieving widow, overwhelmed by impossible decisions. A husband trapped between life and death. Medical professionals who would see only compassion in her choice to let him go peacefully. No blood on anyone's hands. No investigation. Just a tragic accident followed by a merciful release. She had underestimated him before. Marco remembered the early days of their marriage, when she'd tried to convince him to leave the life, to walk away from everything he'd built and start fresh somewhere else. He'd dismissed her concerns, patronized her fears, treated her like a child who couldn't understand the complexities of his world. Now he realized she'd been studying that world more carefully than he'd ever imagined. The morning brought Dr. Reeves, the hospital administrator Elena had been speaking with. Marco recognized his voice from previous conversations, but today felt different, more formal, more final. Mrs. Santelli, I've reviewed your husband's case with our ethics committee, Dr. Reeves said. Given the extent of his injuries and the lack of neurological response, your decision to transition to palliative care is medically sound. Thank you, doctor. This isn't easy, but I know it's what Marco would want. Marco felt bile rise in his throat. Elena's performance was flawless. The grief in her voice sounded genuine. The hesitation before each decision felt authentic. If he hadn't heard her true thoughts over the past 3 days, he might have believed it himself. We can begin the transition this afternoon, Dr. Reeves continued. We'll gradually reduce life support and increase comfort medications. The process typically takes 24 to 48 hours. Will he feel any pain? No, Mrs. Santelli. He'll be completely comfortable. I promise you that. The irony wasn't lost on Marco. He would be comfortable while they killed him. After the doctor left, Elena remained alone with him for nearly an hour. She didn't speak this time. She simply sat beside the bed, occasionally reaching out to touch his hand or brush imaginary lint from his blanket. The silence felt heavier than her words had been. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a tone Marco had never heard before. Not the calculated whispers of the past few days, but something deeper, sadder. I really did love you once, she said, before the business consumed everything. Before you stopped seeing me as Elena and started seeing me as just another asset to protect. She sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. Do you remember our first apartment? That tiny place above the bakery on Mulberry Street? You used to bring me flowers from the corner market every Friday. Cheap carnations that lasted 3 days, but they meant everything to me. Marco remembered. He remembered being 25 and thinking he could balance both worlds. He remembered believing love was enough to bridge any gap. He remembered being wrong. When did you stop bringing me flowers? Elena asked. When did you stop seeing me at all? The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Vincent says it's business, she continued, that you were protecting me by keeping me separate from that life. But protection feels a lot like abandonment when you're living it every day. She stood up, moving to the window. Marco could hear the rain growing heavier outside. He's been very helpful, Vincent has, explaining things you never bothered to explain. About the money, about the dangers, about what happens to wives when their husbands don't come home. Her voice hardened again, the vulnerability disappearing. Did you know he's been in love with me for 8 years? He told me last week. Said he's been watching you neglect me, watching you take me for granted, and it's been killing him. Marco's fists clenched beneath the blanket, but the movement was too slight to notice. Vincent hadn't just betrayed him professionally. This was personal. This was about taking everything Marco had built, including his wife. He asked me to leave with him, Elena said. After. When this is all over. To disappear somewhere you can't follow us. She returned to the bedside, her voice dropping to that intimate whisper again. I told him I'd think about it. But honestly, I'm tired of running from your world, Marco. I'm tired of being afraid. Maybe it's time I learned how to navigate it myself. The implication was clear. Elena wasn't just planning to inherit his empire. She was planning to run it. Vincent thinks I don't understand the business, she said. He thinks I'm just a grieving widow who needs his protection. But I've been watching you for 15 years. I know where the bodies are buried. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Literally and figuratively. Marco had always been careful about what he discussed at home. But Elena was right. She'd been watching, learning, absorbing information he'd thought he was keeping from her. The offshore accounts Vincent told me about? I've known about those for 3 years. The warehouse in Queens where you store things that aren't supposed to exist. I drove past it every week when I went to my book club. Marco's mind raced. His book club. Elena's Tuesday evening book club that had been meeting for 4 years. The one that met at different locations around the city. The one that had given her perfect cover to surveil his operations. My book club friends are very interesting women, Elena continued. Retired FBI, former prosecutors, corporate lawyers who specialize in asset forfeiture. Amazing what you can learn when you're just a concerned wife asking hypothetical questions about her husband's business. The scope of her preparation was staggering. This wasn't a crime of opportunity born from his accident. This was years in the making. A careful, methodical plan to understand his world well enough to either escape it or control it. Tomorrow, they'll begin reducing your life support, Elena said. Vincent will be here to comfort me through the difficult transition. The funeral will be beautiful, very tasteful, very sad. She paused, and Marco could hear her breathing. And then we'll see who really built this empire, won't we? Her footsteps moved toward the door, but she stopped at the threshold. Sleep well, my love. Tomorrow is going to be a very big day. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Marco alone with the weight of Elena's revelations. She wasn't just betraying him. She was evolving, taking everything he'd taught her about survival and strategy and turning it against him. But she had made one crucial error in her planning. She assumed that because he'd never included her in his world, he'd never prepared for the possibility that someone inside his home might become a threat. Marco had contingencies for everything. Hidden recording devices throughout the house. Separate communication channels that bypassed normal networks. Loyal soldiers who reported directly to him, not through the chain of command. And most importantly, he had taught himself something Elena clearly hadn't learned yet. In his world, trust was a luxury that could get you killed. But paranoia? Paranoia kept you alive. As the rain continued against the windows and the machines maintained their steady rhythm, Marco began to activate those contingencies, not with his voice or his hands, but with the one thing Elena couldn't monitor or control, his mind. Because the most dangerous weapon in any war isn't the gun or the knife. It's the ability to think 3 moves ahead while your enemy is still celebrating their first victory. Elena thought she was playing chess, but Marco had been playing a much more complex game all along, and tomorrow, when she made her final move, she would discover that the king she thought she'd captured had never been on the board at all. The real game was just beginning. The board at all. The real game was just beginning. Dawn broke on the 5th day, but Marco couldn't see it through the closed blinds. He could only feel the shift in energy as the hospital awakened around him. Nurses changing shifts, doctors making rounds, the careful choreography of medical professionals who had no idea they were about to become unwitting accomplices to murder. Today was the day Elena would begin transitioning him to comfort care. Today was the day she believed she would start the final phase of her plan. But Marco had spent the night preparing his own surprise. The first voice he heard belonged to Vincent Corelli. His underboss entered the room quietly, speaking in hushed tones with Elena near the window. Marco had known Vincent for 12 years, had trusted him with his life on more than one occasion, had considered him the closest thing to a brother he'd ever had. "The paperwork is ready," Vincent said. "Once the doctors begin the process, everything transfers to you automatically. Legal guardianship, medical authority, financial control." "And the other arrangements?" Elena asked. "Already in motion. Tony Ricci will handle the will. The funeral home is prepared, and I've spoken to the family heads about the transition of territories." Marco felt his jaw clench beneath the bandages. Vincent was already negotiating the division of his empire, already positioning himself as Elena's protector and advisor, already planning to step into the power vacuum that Marco's death would create. "What about resistance?" Elena asked. "Some of the crews might not accept the change." "They'll accept it," Vincent replied, his voice carrying an edge Marco had never heard before. "Or they'll be replaced." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Reeves entering with a team of nurses. Marco recognized the sound of equipment being wheeled into position, the tools they would use to ease him into death. "Mrs. Santelli," Dr. Reeves said gently, "are you ready to proceed?" "I am," Elena replied, her voice steady. This is what he would want. Marco listened as they explained the process, how they would gradually reduce the ventilator settings, how they would increase the morphine to ensure he remained comfortable, how the end would come peacefully, naturally, without suffering. If only they knew how much he was suffering already. "We'll begin with reducing the oxygen levels," Dr. Reeves explained. "This typically takes several hours. You're welcome to stay with him throughout the process." "Thank you," Elena said. "I want to be here when he goes." The machines around Marco began to change their rhythm, subtle adjustments that would slowly starve his brain of oxygen. The medical team worked with professional efficiency, making notes on charts, monitoring readings, ensuring everything proceeded according to protocol. But Marco had been preparing for this moment since yesterday afternoon, using a technique he'd learned during his brief stint in military service decades ago. He'd been practicing controlled breathing, slowing his metabolism, training his body to function on less oxygen than normal. It wouldn't save him indefinitely, but it might buy him enough time to execute the plan that had been forming in his mind since Elena's revelations began. As the medical team finished their initial adjustments and left the room, Elena settled into the chair beside his bed. Vincent remained by the window, occasionally checking his phone, occasionally watching the monitors that displayed Marco's vital signs. "How long did they say it would take?" Vincent asked. 24 to 48 hours, Elena replied. "Maybe less, given how much damage the accident caused." They spoke about Marco's death with the casual detachment of people discussing the weather. No grief, no regret, just logistics and timelines and the practical considerations of transferring power. "I've been thinking about what you said," Elena continued, "about leaving after this is over." Marco's attention sharpened despite the growing fog in his mind from the reduced oxygen. "And?" Vincent asked. "I don't think I want to run anymore," Elena said. "This empire cost me 15 years of my life. I want something back for that investment." "Elena, you don't understand how dangerous—" "I understand perfectly," she interrupted. "You think I'm some sheltered wife who needs protection. But I've been preparing for this longer than you know." She stood up, moving to where Vincent stood by the window. Marco could hear their voices more clearly now, could sense the tension building between them. "I know about the skimming," Elena said quietly. "The money you've been moving through shell companies, the deals you've been making behind Marco's back." "What are you talking about? Did you really think I was just playing house all these years? I know about the warehouse in Brooklyn, the one that's not on any of Marco's books, the one where you've been storing merchandise from the hijacked shipments." Marco's heart rate spiked. but the monitors showed only a slight fluctuation. Vincent had been stealing from him, running side operations, building his own power base while pretending loyalty. Elena, you're confused. Am I? Then explain the offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Account number 7N749823. The one that's been receiving deposits every month for the past 18 months. The silence that followed was deafening. Marco could practically hear Vincent's mind racing, trying to calculate how much Elena knew, how much danger he was in. You've been planning this for a long time, haven't you? Elena continued, getting close to me, offering comfort and support, building trust, all while you bled Marco's organization dry. It wasn't like that. Of course it was. You saw an opportunity when I started asking questions about the business, a way to get rid of Marco and take control of everything he built, including me. Marco felt a surge of something unexpected, not anger, though that was certainly present, not betrayal, though that cut deep, but pride. Elena had played them both, had let Vincent think he was manipulating her while she gathered evidence of his treachery. What do you want? Vincent asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. I want the truth, Elena replied. All of it. The money you've stolen, the deals you've made, the people you've turned against. Marco. And then what? Then we decide whether you're more valuable as an ally or as an example. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Elena wasn't just inheriting Marco's empire. She was adopting his methods. You can't run this organization, Vincent said desperately. The other families won't accept a woman in charge. The crews won't follow you. They'll follow strength, Elena replied calmly. And they'll follow fear. Marco taught me that much. She returned to Marco's bedside, her voice dropping to that intimate whisper he'd grown to dread. Did you hear that, my love? Vincent's been stealing from you. All those late nights he claimed to be working for the family. He was working for himself. She brushed his hair back from his forehead with false tenderness. Don't worry, though. I'll make sure he pays for it. After you're gone, of course. Can't have any distractions during your transition. Marco's mind raced despite the oxygen deprivation. Elena had just revealed that she knew about Vincent's betrayal, which meant she had known all along, which meant she had been planning to eliminate him too, once Marco was dead and Vincent had served his purpose. She wasn't just smarter than Vincent had given her credit for. She was smarter than Marco had ever imagined. The beautiful thing about this plan, Elena continued, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction, is that everyone gets what they deserve. You get to rest after years of carrying this burden. Vincent gets to pay for his disloyalty, and I get to build something new from the ashes of what you created. But as Elena spoke those words, something extraordinary happened. Marco's finger twitched, just once, so slight that only someone watching very carefully would notice. Elena had taught him something valuable in those final moments. She'd shown him that the empire he'd built wasn't just about territory and money. It was about loyalty, about knowing who you could trust when everything fell apart. And now Marco knew exactly who that was. The monitors began to beep faster. Elena looked up, startled. Vincent moved closer to the bed, and for the first time in 5 days, Marco Santelli opened his eyes. What happened next would become legend in the streets of Brooklyn. Because sometimes the greatest power isn't in building an empire. It's in knowing when to let your enemies think they've already won. Marco had learned the most dangerous lesson of all. The people closest to you aren't always the ones you can trust. But when you discover the truth, that's when you truly understand who deserves your loyalty.